In the dry and dusty outskirts of Mbale, Uganda, a quiet maid named Namboka worked in a house that did not belong to her. Every day, she cleaned floors, scrubbed dishes, and folded clothes that were not hers. She stayed silent, even when the insults came. Even when she was treated like she didn't matter. But Namboka had a secret. When no one was watching, she wrote stories. Not in notebooks or on fancy paper, she couldn't afford those. She wrote on anything she could find, torn receipts, old calendars, empty rice sacks, even the backs of grocery lists. Her pen was sometimes a pencil stub, sometimes borrowed ink. But her words were full of life. Full of pain. Full of hope. Every sentence carried a piece of her soul. When others slept, she wrote. When she cried, she wrote. She had no audience, no readers. But still, she wrote. It was the only thing that made her feel alive. In those hidden lines, she created worlds where maids became queens and pain turned into power. No one in that house knew about her stories. They only saw a tired maid with rough hands and silent lips. But on paper, she was a storm. She didn't know it yet, but her words were about to change everything, not just for her, but for people she had never met. Because even in the shadows, truth finds a way to shine. And Namboka's words were full of truth. One quiet evening, after everyone in the house had eaten and gone to their rooms, Namboka stayed in the kitchen a little longer to finish her work. As always, she kept a folded piece of paper in her pocket. It was a story she had written the night before, one that had come to her in a dream. She had written it on the back of an old grocery list with a pen that barely worked. Her heart was in every word, but she had no place to keep it safe. Later, when she swept the floor and emptied the trash bin, the paper slipped from her pocket without her noticing. It landed quietly among food wrappers and torn plastic bags. The next morning, Aiken, the employer's teenage daughter, was looking through the trash for a craft project. Her hand stopped when she saw the crumpled paper. Curious, she opened it and began to read. At first, she didn't think much of it. But as her eyes moved from one line to the next, she became completely still. The story was about a girl who felt invisible, who worked all day but was never seen, yet still dreamed of being a writer. Aiken read it twice. Her heart felt heavy, and her throat was tight. She had never read anything so honest, so raw. She didn't laugh. She didn't mock. Instead, she took a photo of the story and typed out the words into a storytelling website she followed. She didn't even tell her parents. She used the name Silent Soul and pressed publish. By the time she woke up the next day, something unbelievable had happened. The story had spread like fire. Thousands of people had read it. Hundreds had left comments. Some said they cried. Others said they felt like someone had finally put their own pain into words. There were shares on social media, messages from people in different countries, and people writing things like, "This story feels like a hug I didn't know I needed." Aiken scrolled through the comments again and again, her hands shaking. And then she saw one comment that made her eyes fill with tears. It said, "I'd buy you 100 coffees if I could. You saved my life." That one comment was shared more than any other. People made art out of it. They made quotes and videos with soft music in the background, reading lines from the story aloud. Aiken sat in her room, phone in her hand, not knowing what to do. She wanted to tell Namboka right away, but she was scared her parents would be angry, or that Namboka might get in trouble. Still, deep down, she felt proud. She had helped something special reach the world. She had helped give a voice to someone who never had one. She didn't know how or when to tell Namboka the truth. But what she did know was this: the world had finally heard the quiet maid's voice. And they didn't just listen. They felt every word. Namboka had no idea that her story was being read by thousands of people. She didn't know it had gone viral or that strangers were crying over her words. She still woke up early, scrubbed floors, washed clothes, and stayed silent, just like every other day. The paper she had lost was long gone from her mind. But deep in her heart, something still whispered hope. She didn't know why, but she kept writing, even if no one ever saw it. Then one evening, everything changed. The sun was setting, and Namboka had just finished washing the dishes. She was wiping her hands when the door suddenly slammed open. Her employer's husband stormed into the house, his face red with anger. He was shouting loudly, holding his phone in one hand and waving it around. "Who used my Wi-Fi for a viral story?" he yelled. His voice echoed through the whole house. Everyone froze. Namboka stood still, unsure of what was happening. He showed the story on his phone, shouting about the data charges, the sudden attention, the internet speed slowing down. He didn't care about the beauty of the story or the comments. He only cared that it had gone viral using his internet. Aiken stood quietly in the corner, scared to speak. She wanted to say it was her, but her voice refused to come out. The man looked around, and his eyes landed on Namboka. Without asking questions, he pointed at her. "It must be you. You're always writing useless things." Before she could explain, he grabbed her arm, pushed her down, and started beating her. She cried out, begging him to stop. But he didn't listen. Her body ached. Her head spun. Aiken cried too, but no one helped. Then, just like that, Namboka was thrown out of the house. No warning. No pay. No shoes. Nothing. The door slammed behind her. She stood outside in the cold night, her hands shaking and her body bruised. She had nowhere to go. She sat on the ground, leaning against the gate, tears falling down her face. In that moment, she remembered her mother's words spoken long ago, when she was just a little girl crying after being bullied at school. Her mother had wiped her tears and said, "One day, your pain will become your power." That memory wrapped around her like a blanket. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring. She didn't know where she would sleep or what she would eat. But she knew this: she had something no one could take from her. Her words. Her stories. Her voice. She stood up slowly, wiped her tears, and began to walk. With every step, her mother's voice echoed in her heart. "Your pain will become your power." She didn't feel strong yet, but something deep inside her had changed. The world had hurt her, but it hadn't broken her. Not yet. Namboka had no home, no job, no food, and nowhere to sleep. But she still had something burning inside her: hope. Her body was tired, her feet were sore, and her bruises still hurt, but she refused to give up. With nothing but a small bag and the clothes on her back, she started walking. She had heard once that there was an internet cafe 14 kilometers away, near the center of town. She didn't know exactly where it was, but she walked anyway. Step after step. Through dust, past strangers, past children playing and people staring. Some laughed at her. Some ignored her. But she kept walking. Not because she was sure of anything, but because something inside her told her the truth was waiting for her. Something she needed to see. Hours later, hungry and exhausted, she finally found the small cafe. It was not much, just a few old computers and a man sitting behind a desk. She asked if she could use the internet for just a few minutes. The man looked at her, saw her worn-out face and tired eyes, and quietly nodded. She sat down and typed the name of the storytelling website. Her hands shook. She typed "Silent Soul" into the search bar. And then her breath stopped. Her story, the one she thought was lost forever, was on the front page. There were thousands of hearts next to it. Thousands of comments. People from all over the world had read it. They wrote messages like, "I felt every word. You told my story without knowing me. I'm alive today because of you." She kept scrolling, unable to believe her eyes. There were photos, videos, quotes, all made from her words. People had shared her pain, and they had found healing in it. Then she noticed something else. A small button under the story that said, "Buy me a coffee." She clicked it. Her heart skipped. There were hundreds of donations. People had sent money from different countries. Some gave small amounts, some gave large ones, but the messages were what made her cry. "This is for the writer who saved my life. Keep writing, please. We need you." And at the bottom of every post, every story, was one simple line she had never written herself, someone had added it for her. "If my stories made you feel something, buy me a coffee, and keep the magic alive." Namboka covered her mouth with her hands. Tears fell down her cheeks, but they were not tears of pain this time. They were full of shock, of joy, of disbelief. She wasn't invisible anymore. People had seen her, even though they didn't know her name. They had felt her heart through her words. They believed in her. In that tiny internet cafe, Namboka smiled for the first time in days. The same stories she had written in secret, the ones she thought no one would ever care about, had reached the world. She had nothing in her pockets, but in that moment, she had something bigger than money. She had her voice. And now, the world was listening. Days passed, and Namboka's life began to change slowly but beautifully. The money from the donated coffees added up. Bit by bit, she was able to buy herself food, clothes, and finally, a small place to live. It was nothing fancy, just one room with a bed, a window, and a door that locked. But to her, it felt like a palace. It was hers. No one could throw her out this time. She could write whenever she wanted. She didn't have to hide her papers under dirty clothes or worry about someone finding them in the trash. For the first time in her life, she was free. With her savings, she bought her very first laptop. It wasn't brand new, but it worked. She placed it on a small table beside her bed and stared at it with tears in her eyes. No more writing on grocery lists or torn calendars. Now, she could type freely, as much as she wanted. Every key she pressed felt like a soft drumbeat of victory. She wrote story after story, each one deeper, braver, and more powerful than the last. People kept reading, and they kept sending love. More donations came in. More messages. Some said, "Your stories helped me speak after years of silence." Others wrote, "I didn't know I needed healing until your words found me." Then one day, her phone buzzed. It was an email from a big publishing house. They had read her stories online and wanted to publish a full book. Her book. With her real name on the cover. She couldn't believe it. Her hands shook as she read the message again and again. The girl who once had nothing now had a voice the world wanted to hear. Weeks later, her book came out. And just like her first story, it touched hearts everywhere. It climbed up the bestseller list until her name was printed on the front page of newspapers and bookshops. Radio stations began calling her for interviews. One morning, as she spoke on air, the host smiled and said, "You're more than a writer, Namboka. You're the voice from the ashes." That name stuck. People started calling her that everywhere. Because she didn't rise from comfort, she rose from pain, from silence, from fire. And yet, she didn't let it burn her down. Instead, she turned the ashes into stories that healed others. Readers from around the world kept writing to her. Many had never experienced the same struggles she had, but still, they said her stories gave them comfort. Gave them courage. Gave them language for the pain they didn't know how to speak. Some called her their mirror. Others called her their light. But Namboka didn't see herself as anything special. She still remembered the girl scrubbing floors, hiding stories in her pockets. And she knew there were many others like her out there, quiet voices waiting to be heard. So she kept writing. Not for fame. Not for money. But for that one reader who might be crying at 2 a.m., looking for something to hold on to. Because she knew now, stories don't just tell. They heal. One bright morning, Namboka received an invitation that made her heart race. She had been asked to speak at a big writing conference in the capital city. It was a gathering of authors, poets, readers, and lovers of stories from all over the country. She stared at the message, not believing her eyes. A few years ago, no one even knew her name. Now, people wanted to hear her speak, not as a maid, not as a servant, but as a writer. As someone whose words had touched lives. She packed her small bag, wore her best dress, and traveled to the capital with butterflies in her stomach. When she reached the conference hall, it was already full. Bright lights, cameras, people with notebooks and warm smiles. Her name was written on the screen behind the stage, Namboka, the voice from the ashes. When it was time for her to speak, she stepped onto the stage with slow, calm steps. The lights were bright, and her hands trembled slightly. But as she looked into the crowd, something made her stop. There, in the middle row, was a young woman. Her hands were covering her mouth, tears falling down her cheeks. Namboka's eyes widened. It was Aiken, her old employer's daughter. The same girl who had secretly uploaded her first story to the internet. The girl who had believed in her when no one else did. Their eyes met, and time seemed to freeze. In the middle of the crowded hall, filled with authors and important guests, Namboka stepped down from the stage. She walked straight to Aiken and pulled her into a hug. The room went silent, then slowly erupted into applause. People stood up, clapping and cheering, but the two women held each other tightly. They didn't need to say much. Their hearts were already speaking. Namboka leaned in close and whispered, "Your one act saved my life. My words saved others." Aiken nodded through her tears. She had carried guilt for years, for staying silent the night Namboka was beaten and thrown out. But now she saw what her small action had truly done. It had opened a door. It had changed a life. And that life had gone on to touch thousands more. Back on the stage, Namboka spoke to the audience. She didn't talk about fame or success. She spoke about pain, about silence, about stories written on torn receipts and thrown away. She spoke about being invisible, and how one kind action, just one, had changed everything. The room listened in complete silence, many with tears in their eyes. After the talk, people lined up to meet her, to thank her, to tell her how her stories had helped them face their own truths. But Namboka kept looking back at Aiken, smiling. She knew that none of this would have happened without her. That young girl had passed the light forward, and now, it was lighting up the world. In her heart, Namboka knew this was only the beginning. There were still many more stories to tell. Many more lives to touch. And all because one girl once believed in a voice hidden in the trash. The evening was calm, and the conference was over. Namboka sat alone in her hotel room, the soft city lights glowing through the window. Her heart was full. The cheers, the hugs, the faces she had seen today, all of it felt like a dream. But for her, the most powerful moment had not been the applause. It had been the quiet hug with Aiken. The moment their paths crossed again, the circle of kindness completed. Now, as the lights dimmed and the world outside went to sleep, Namboka opened her laptop. The same one she had bought after walking 14 kilometers to an internet cafe. The same one that had become her window to the world. She placed her fingers on the keyboard and smiled. She began typing her next story. No pressure. No fear. Just honesty and heart. Her bio under the story was simple. It didn't brag. It didn't beg. It only said, "If my stories made you feel something, buy me a coffee. And keep the magic alive." And like magic, the donations began to pour in once again. People from every corner of the world bought her a coffee, sent her a kind note, or shared her story with a friend. But even more special than the money were the messages. Your story helped me speak to my daughter. I cried tonight. Thank you. You put into words what I couldn't. Namboka smiled softly. Her stories were more than words. They were light in dark places. Her pain had truly become her power. And now, that power was healing others, one heart at a time.